I feel that I'm simply helping people develop intellectual self-defense.
Social media tends to drive people into self-reinforcing bubbles. It's driving people even to more extreme views. Join me as we discuss some of the most pressing topics of our time. For every serious problem we face, there are feasible answers. I'm Noam Chomsky, and this is Masterclass.
You write in Manufacturing Consent that it's the primary function of the mass media in the United States to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and the private sector. What are those interests?
Well, if you want to understand the way any society works, ours or any other, the first place to look is who's in a position to make the decisions that determine the way the society functions. Societies differ, but in ours, the major decisions over what happens in the society, decisions over investment and production and distribution and so on, are in the hands of a relatively concentrated network of major corporations and conglomerates and investment firms and so on. They are also the ones who staff the major executive positions in the government, and they're the ones who own the media, and they're the ones who have to be in a position to make the decisions. They have an overwhelmingly dominant role in the way life happens, what's done in the society. Within the economic system, by law and in principle, they dominate. The control over resources and the need to satisfy their interests imposes very sharp constraints on the political system and the ideological system.
When we talk about manufacturing of consent, whose consent is being manufactured?
We can, to start with, there are two different groups. We can get into more detail, but at the first level of approximation, there's two targets for propaganda. One is what's sometimes called the political class. There's maybe 20% of the population which is relatively educated, more or less articulate. They play some kind of role in decision-making. They're supposed to sort of participate in social life, either as managers or cultural managers, like, say, teachers and writers and so on. They're supposed to vote. They're supposed to play some role in the way economic and political and cultural life goes on. Now, their consent is crucial. It's one group that has to be deeply indoctrinated. Then there's maybe 80% of the population whose main function is to follow orders and not to think, and not to pay attention to anything. And they're the ones who usually pay the cost.
All right. Professor Chomsky, no. You outlined a model with filters that propaganda is sent through. That's way to the public. Can you briefly outline those?
It's basically an institutional analysis of the major media, what we call a propaganda model. We're talking primarily about the national media, those media that sort of set a general agenda that others more or less adhere to the extent that they even pay much attention to national or international affairs. Now, the elite media are the sort of the agenda-setting media. That means the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major television channels, and so on. They set the general framework. Local media more or less adapt to their structure.
World News. Begins to sound like it says that there's a beachhead.
I think 628 is a good one.
Yeah, but I think 6 is a good start.
This is the operative soundbite for us. He's ours. He really knows how to count.
We've got a minute for all the time, so that's...
I love this soundbite.
Okay,
and they do this in all sorts of ways, by selection of topics, by distribution of concerns, by emphasis and framing of issues, by filtering of information, by bounding of debate within certain limits.
2.5 minutes to air. 45 seconds.
They determine, they select, they shape, they control, they restrict in order to serve the interests of dominant elite groups in the society.
There is an unusual amount of attention focused today on the 5 nations of Central America.
This is Democracy's Diary. Here for our instruction are triumphs and disasters, the pattern of life's changing fabric. Here is great journalism, a revelation of the past, a guide to the present, and a clue to the future.
The New York Times is certainly the most important newspaper in the United States, and one could argue the most important newspaper in the world. The New York Times plays an enormous role in shaping the perception of the current world on the part of the politically active, educated classes. Also, the New York Times has a special role, and I believe its editors probably feel that they bear a heavy burden, in the sense that the New York Times creates history.
What happened years ago may have a bearing on what happens tomorrow. Millions of clippings are preserved in the Times library, all indexed for instant use, a priceless archive of events and the men who make them.
That is, history is what appears in the New York Times archives. The place where people will go to find out what happened is the New York Times. Therefore, it's extremely important, if history is going to be shaped in an appropriate way, that certain things appear, certain things not appear, certain questions be asked, other questions be ignored, and that issues be framed in a particular fashion. Now, in whose interests is the history being so shaped? Well, I think that's not very difficult to answer.
Now, to eliminate confusion, all of this has nothing to do with liberal or conservative bias. According to the propaganda model, both liberal and conservative wings of the media, whatever those terms are supposed to mean, fall within the same framework of assumptions. In fact, if the system functions well, it ought to have a liberal bias, or at least appear to, because if it appears to have a liberal bias, that will serve to bound thought even more effectively. In other words, if the press is indeed adversarial and liberal and all these bad things, then how can I go beyond it? They're already so extreme in their opposition to power that to go beyond it would be to take off from the planet. So therefore, it must be that the presuppositions that are accepted in the liberal media are sacrosanct, can't go beyond them. And a well-functioning system would in fact have a bias of that kind. The media would then serve to say, in effect, thus far and no further.
We ask, what would you expect of those media on just relatively uncontroversial, guided free market assumptions? And when you look at them, you find a number of major factors entering into determining what their products are. These are what we call the filters. So one of them, for example, is ownership. Who owns them?
The major agenda-setting media, after all, what are they? As institutions in the society, what are they? Well, in the first place, they are major corporations, in fact, huge corporations. Furthermore, they're integrated with and sometimes owned by even larger corporations, conglomerates, so for example, by Westinghouse and GE and so on.
What I wanted to know was how specifically the elites control the media. What I mean is, I guess...
It's like asking, how do the elites control General Motors? Well, why isn't that a question? I mean, General Motors is an institution of the elites. They don't have to control it. They own it. So what we have in the first place is major corporations which are parts of even bigger conglomerates. Now, like any other corporation, they have a product which they sell to a market. The market is advertisers, that is, other businesses. What keeps the media functioning is not the audience.
They make money from their advertisers. And remember, we're talking about the elite media, so they're trying to sell a good product, a product which raises advertising rates. And ask your friends in the advertising industry, that means that they want to adjust their audience to the more elite and affluent audience. That raises advertising rates. So what you have is institutions, corporations, big corporations, that are selling relatively privileged audiences to other businesses. Well, what point of view would you expect to come out of this? I mean, without any further assumptions, what you'd predict is that what comes out is a picture of the world, a perception of the world, that satisfies the needs and the interests and the perceptions of the sellers, the buyers, and the product. Now, there are many other factors that press in the same direction. If people try to enter the system who don't have that point of view, they're likely to be excluded somewhere along the way. After all, no institution is going to happily design a mechanism to self-destruct. It's not the way institutions function. So they all work to exclude or marginalize or eliminate dissenting voices or alternative perspectives and so on because they're dysfunctional. dysfunctional to the institution itself.
I'm wondering how you see the role of our educational system, what it's doing right now, what forces are driving it, and what constraints are on it, and how should it operate?
Mm-hmm. Well, I quoted the Trilateral Commission view of the educational system, namely it's a system of indoctrination of the young. And I think that's correct. It's a system of indoctrination of the young. That was the way the liberal elites regard it, and they're more or less accurate. So the educational system is supposed to train people to be obedient, conformist, not think too much, do what you're told, stay passive, don't cause any crises of democracy, don't raise any questions, and so on. That's basically what the system is about. Even the fact that the system has a lot of stupidity in it, I think, has a function. You know, it means that people are filtered out for obedience. If you can guarantee lots of stupidity in the educational system, you know, like stupid assignments and things like that, you know that the only people who will make it through are people like me and like most of you, I guess, who are willing to do it no matter how stupid it is, because we want to go to the next step, you know. So you may know that this assignment is idiotic and the guy up there couldn't think his way out of a paper bag, but you'll do it anyway because that's the way you get to the next class. And you want to make it, and so on and so forth. Well, there are people who don't do that, you know. There are people who say, I'm not going to do it, it's too ridiculous, you know. Those people are called behavioral problems, or something like that. They end up in the principal's office or in the streets or selling drugs or whatever. And all of this is a technique for selection for obedience. And I don't know how to prove this, but I have a feeling that when you go to the elite universities, you find more obedience and conformity. Probably because you're getting the students who were better able to do it. You know? Well, all of that is functional. That's the way it works. And it works right through graduate school. I mean, by the time you get to graduate school, it's already a little more varied because some real contradictions develop in the system. The problem is that you can't have progress this way. You know, now, especially in the sciences and engineering, that's a problem because the corporations need science and engineering. You know, if you don't have innovation, you're really in trouble. So they have to encourage creativity and independence because you can't get anywhere if you just copy what somebody told you. You have to be challenging things all the time, challenging everything, you know, and thinking new thoughts and so on. And there you got a real contradiction. It's hard to train people to be creative and challenging and so on, and yet to ensure that somewhere else in their lives they're conformist and obedient and never think. So you have problems. That's a serious problem in Japan, incidentally. We think of Japan as this tremendous superpower, but that's very misleading. Japan, for example, is very poor in science, for example, and they're aware of it. And part of the reason is it's part of the same thing that makes them good workers, obedient workers. It's a very obedient society, very deferential and conformist society, and one effect of that is that you know there are real constraints against independent, free thinking, and you see it in the sciences very clearly. But it's a problem here too. So there are those contradictions, and when you get to graduate school, they're beginning to show up. They show up much less in the ideological subjects, because there it doesn't matter so much if people have, you know, profits aren't made by historians having original ideas about the French Revolution, so they can have conventional ideas. And that means that the pressure to try to support innovation and freedom is much less, and the pressures for conformity, on the other hand, are much greater, because in the ideological subjects it begins to be dangerous if people think the wrong thoughts. It's not so dangerous if they have new ideas about physics. But nevertheless, you know, you begin to get a little flux in the system by the time you get to graduate school. And even at lower levels, you find it. I mean, there are teachers who do stimulate thought, and sometimes they get away with it. And all the way through, you know, if people are learning things, you just can't control, you can't make them just regurgitate what they heard. Now, there's a lot of pressure to turn the schools into the Marine Corps, and there's a lot of support for it. For example, there's this bestseller last couple of years by Alan Bloom. That was all over the supermarkets, Closing of the American Mind. Whichever, you know, huge bestseller, supermarket racks, which is where I read it, and things like that. Well, you take a look at what he's saying. And there was plenty, a lot of enthusiastic accolades for it and so on. He was saying that a couple of us smart guys will decide what the great thoughts are, and every student will memorize them, and that's education. Okay. Well, that's a way to turn people into pure automata. Even if they happen to pick the great thoughts, there is no way less likely to get anybody to think about those thoughts than to make that the curriculum. That finishes them off, and I think that's the purpose, really. The purpose is just to impose authority, Here's the great thoughts. All this other stuff is rubbish. Just learn those and you're okay. I'll pick them, you memorize them. That's basically the line. Now, of course, that's the opposite of education. That's the way you study Talmud or something like that. But it's very popular, and I think it reflects the same concern over the crisis of democracy. In fact, Bloom himself was extremely, the incident that really got to him was a case in Cornell where he was a professor, where some black students took over one of the buildings. And he said that's just like the Nazis, it's back to the Nazis. He has a whole business about the Nazis and so on and so forth. Well, you take a look at what happened in that. He doesn't tell you what he thought and he says the faculty capitulated, just like Heidegger capitulated to the Nazis and so on. What actually happened, if you look back, is that there were real grievances. Undoubtedly, the students shouldn't have done what they did and go into the building with guns and so on, but it was settled very amicably. It was settled amicably. Nobody was killed. The grievances were to some extent dealt with, and the net result was better than it was before. Well, he didn't tell you what he thought they should have done, but it's sort of implicit. I guess they should have bombed the place or something like that. But that's what really set him off. And in general, what set many people off was the 60s are now described in the literature as if it was a time when students were running around burning libraries and destroying the foundations of civilization and so on. What was actually going on is they were asking questions. They were raising questions. They were looking into things that people hadn't looked into before. They were not just obedient. And from the point of view of a lot of the faculty, that's equivalent to burning the buildings. You can't, that small distinction, you can't make that. There's pressure to turn the schools back to the days when you didn't have to worry about those things, like disobedient students asking questions about things that you didn't tell them to think about and so on. Well, the military is somewhat misunderstood, I think. Actually, I'm in a pretty good position to know it. I've been at MIT for, 65 years, 60 years, I guess. And MIT is a good example of one crucial function of the military system. For many years, right into the 1970s, MIT was almost 100% funded by the Pentagon. It was also the main academic center of resistance against the Vietnam War. My lab, in fact, was one of the main academic centers. I was up for a long jail sentence. The Pentagon didn't give a damn. If you want to overthrow the country, that's your business. They don't care, But what they did give a damn about is creating the next phase of the high-tech economy. The Pentagon was and remains, to a large extent, a kind of a funnel, but into which taxpayers pour funds, diluted into thinking, we're defending ourselves from whoever it may be, and the money goes into developing the next phase of the high-tech economy. So if you use a computer or you use the internet, you fly an airplane, which is a modified bomber, and so on, you're taking advantage of the role of the dynamic state sector in the economy. A lot of what's called entrepreneurial initiative and so on is coming straight out of the state sector. Actually, I once wrote an article a couple of years ago after Alan Greenspan had given one of his orations about the marvels of the free economy, entrepreneurial initiative, consumer choice. He made the mistake of actually listing about a dozen examples. Every single one of them, with one exception, was a textbook case where the work was almost entirely done in the state sector. No consumer choice, no entrepreneurial initiative, just a lot of it paid for by the Pentagon. Actually, there was one exception, which was even more enlightening. It was transistors. he pointed out correctly that transistors were developed in the private sector, AT&T. We didn't explain why. It was because AT&T had a government-guaranteed monopoly, so therefore they could charge monopoly prices, and they could use that benefit to establish a very good lab, Bell Labs. We used to go up and back there all the time in the 50s and 60s. So a great lab, did a lot of things, feeding at the public trough like everything else is. They were using wartime technology, which came out of the government, of course. They couldn't sell advanced computers because they were too expensive, so the government bought them. 100% of the advanced transistors put out by Western Electric around 1960 were picked up by the government. And in fact, if you look, procurement is one of the major means for subsidizing private industry. It was done with computers, it's done with all kinds of things. Until they can get to the point where they can sell things on the market, somebody's got to buy it. Okay, that's the government, usually the Pentagon. So that's one major aspect of the Pentagon, and it continues right to the present. In fact, it was kind of funny around 1970, if you were in this racket, under pressure from the popular anti-war movements, Congress passed legislation. It's called the Mansfield Amendment, which required that all Pentagon-funded work at universities has to be military related. It's a good project for somebody, which I suggest if you want. Take a look at the DARPA, which is Advanced Research Project Agency, the one that does the fancy stuff. If you look at I've looked at a couple of them, but I suspect it's uniform. If you look at the DARPA reports, what people wrote about what they're doing, you got to put in a description every year of what you've been doing. Before the Mansfield Amendment, people just said what they were doing. After the Mansfield Amendment, the reports have two parts. The first one begins with some fakery about military applications which don't exist. And the second part, which they figure the generals will never get to, is about what they're actually doing. But that's one major component, one major function of the Pentagon. And you can do it because you can delude people. People think we got to defend ourselves, so we'll pour money into this. The other one is just beating people up. It's not a small thing.
Just 1 or 2 more minutes.
Yeah, okay. If you want to run the world, you got to have force. There's a reason why the United States is the only country in the world that has roughly 1,000 military bases around the world, has missile systems, nuclear systems aimed at anybody in sight who might someday be a problem, and so on. So that's important. There is what Dean Baker called a nanny state for the rich, and one large part of it is making sure that the rich are protected. Okay, so that's the other function of the military system.
You have both led intriguing lives as radical activist intellectuals. Tell us when you got started on this path. Was there a special incident that provoked your involvement, or something in your family background that prompted your activism?
I got to remember farther back, so I'll go first. Well, I was a child of the Depression. Came from good part of my family was it was an immigrant family, first-generation immigrants, like other immigrant ethnic communities, very bound to the ethnic group, Jewish in this case. My immediate family, a lot of them were most of them, in fact, were working-class people. That meant mostly unemployed, wide range of, it was a very lively period, and it was very intellectually alive, a lot of activism, and, I sort of grew up in the middle of it. I don't know what to point to. I mean, I have early childhood memories of people coming to the door hungry, trying to sell rags, of traveling on streetcars with my mother and passing by
strikes, textile strikes, where women were outside being beaten up by police. We have a very violent labor history in the United States, and unusual, in fact unique in the industrial world. And till the late 30s, workers were still getting murdered by private and government security forces. Meanwhile, fascism was extending over Europe. It was very frightening. I could see it as a child. We happened to be the only Jewish family in a very anti-Semitic neighborhood, and the immediate surroundings were scary, you know, especially with those black clouds in the background. There just was not ever much of a question. By the time I was 11 or 12, I was hanging around anarchist bookstores in New York and, you know, talking to guys who had escaped from Spain during the, you know, after the fascists took over, and so it continued.
When did I get started? My parents were activists, radicals, before I was born. My father was working on something called the Texas white primary, and it was a Democratic primary. The South was all Democrat back then, and there were activists, both black and white, in East Texas trying to put an end to the all-white primary. My mother was active in school desegregation in Virginia at the time when blacks could go to black elementary school, black high school, and black colleges. But if you wanted to go if you wanted to go to graduate school, there was no place in Virginia. So one of her friends was a plaintiff in a lawsuit against the state of Virginia to allow blacks to attend the University of Virginia so they could go to graduate school. And the state of Virginia settled it. And instead of allowing any black person to attend the University of Virginia, what they said is that they would pay their tuition to go to any college, any graduate school in the United States that would take them. So my mother took advantage of this and went to study. She was a mathematician. She went to study at the University of Michigan, which was a much better deal, actually, than University of Virginia. And my parents met there. So she had been an activist. He was an activist. He would come up from Texas and work on his PhD in rural social development, rural sociology, something that was called community development, but that at that time, at that era, very few people knew about it. So I was born into this family, but I was also born around the time that the McCarthy era was becoming very intense. And so even though my parents were active and most of their friends were activists, they never talked about it. I never heard about these things. I read about them much, much later. When I begin to remember as being a young child in Tuskegee Institute in Alabama in the 1940s and 50s, where I lived, Tuskegee Institute was 45 miles away from Montgomery, and it was a place where people who started the Montgomery bus boycott in the 1950s, civil rights work, would come and have meetings, and they'd plan to do things, and there were boycotts, and I remember going on boycotts, and I remember hearing about voter registration campaigns and lawsuits. I think Million versus Lightfoot is the suit about the gerrymander of Tuskegee. So the world in which I came conscious was an activist world challenging segregation. And then when I was 9 years old, my father stopped teaching at Tuskegee Institute. He went to work in a program that at that time was called Technical Cooperation Mission, later came to be called Agency for International Development. But he went to India in the 1950s at a time when the United States government was beginning to try in third world countries, in non-white areas and non-European areas, to persuade the government not to be friendly with communists. And one of the ways they decided to persuade the government of India, which was very independent and had just gotten out of a colonial relationship with a European power, with Britain, was to persuade them that the United States was not like their former colonial power. And how did they do this? They found black technicians to send to India to work in villages. My father was one. He took me, and I just looked and saw a beautiful, impressive world in which the entire government and the entire country was run by people of color, and they seemed to be doing quite a good job. And so it was it never occurred to me that there was any validity or any sense or any reason for whites to run everybody's lives. So I immediately became totally incompatible improperly socialized to grow up in Alabama. I mean, where I'm living, you know, the black people run the country, the minister and the president and the prime minister. But in Alabama, where my friends are growing up, their parents, who may have graduate degrees, who have skin color similar, they can't even vote. They can't vote. They can't do anything. So immediately I know this is wrong. Now, the incident that kind of triggered my involvement was later. I was a high school student in 1962, I believe, 62, 63, and I saw on the pages of the newspaper outside of Philadelphia in the high school that I was attending. I was at a boarding school. My parents were living in Africa. I was there. There was one black professor, one black student from the town, 2 black boarders, and a Japanese student and an African. The rest of the people were white, everybody. So I'm in this world that's very white. It's the first time in my life. I'd lived in Africa and Asia and Macon County, and you don't see too many white people in any of those places. And these girls were in the back of a paddy wagon, and they were smiling and they were singing. And the story was about the Albany, Georgia protest against the denial of the right to vote, and the high school students who were getting arrested because they were protesting, and they would go to jail and they would sing. And what was so intriguing was that they were smiling, and I said, well, they look so happy. And a young woman put a sign outside the dining hall and said, we should fast in sympathy with the students from Albany who are fasting in jail. And I went on in the dining hall, didn't think about it, and the next day I came in and there was another sign up that said, fasting is stupid. We shouldn't do that. We should find something more cooperative to do to solve this problem. And I became infuriated. Who is this student? Of course, they're all white, because and I know it wasn't one of the black students who put this note up. So who is this white boy who's so protected, who has a superior attitude that he can tell young black women in Georgia who are risking their lives to change the system what they should do? So I just became infuriated, decided I was going to find out everything about that struggle. I went to Philadelphia. I talked to activists who trained people to go down to Albany. I wrote everything down. I came back in a fury, wrote out a 2-page speech, and asked if I could speak at the assembly. Our school had an assembly every Tuesday and Thursday. And I asked the art teacher, who was my friend. She said, oh, sure. She didn't ask me what I wanted to talk about. She said, sure, Kathleen, you can speak at the assembly. And I got up and I read this speech and told them what this movement was about and what these students were doing and why they were doing it and why Martin Luther King was right and why nonviolence was a good thing and why they should support them. And literally, I had no idea that this would upset people. It's a Quaker school. I thought they were for nonviolent protest. Well, that's the event that sort of got me going. And then in the same town, Tuskegee, where I was from, one of my classmates, a young man I grew up with, when I was a college student here in New York, was murdered, shot in the back by a gas station attendant. My friend's name was Sammy Young. He was a student, he was a SNCC worker, he was an activist, and he was murdered after receiving lots and lots and lots of death threats, but he was murdered in an argument with a white gas station attendant over which bathroom he was going to use, the one that used to be identified for white men or the one that used to be identified for colored males, because the signs had been taken down. He was shot in the back and left at the Greyhound bus station across the street. And that incident was very personal, very painful, and I'd say 6 months later I was no longer a college student. I was a civil rights worker. I was a full-time civil rights worker, and gradually just became more and more revolutionary as the resistance against our efforts to change the society increased.
Okay.
What a short answer.
No, it's a good answer. What has allowed you both to maintain your momentum for so many years? And I should, you know, all of us know that many people our age have fallen by the wayside. The politics change, you get older, you're thinking about all kinds of things, but both of you have continued on in doing the work that you do. What makes that possible?
Like another reason.
The real reason, the secret, the reason no one will tell you is that it's joyful to struggle. You always feel, at least I feel, happiest when I know I'm doing something that can in some way break through and break down the kind of barriers that restrict people's ability to be creative, to be whole, to be healthy, and it makes me happy. Now, it makes a lot of other people feel different things, and sometimes I've wondered, I mean, as I walk into situations where people are trying to kill me, or walk into situations where it looks like, oh, this might be it, I don't really feel joy then, but I will say that I talked my father into letting me join the civil rights movement with this argument. I said, you're sending me to college. You're paying, now you can tell how long ago this was, you're paying $800 a semester. I'm not getting a good education. Give me the money, let me join the movement, and I'll really get an education. And he said, okay, I'll do it for 1 year. And I took the money and I went to the civil rights movement because the movement was so collapsed, it had not enough, didn't have money to pay people's salaries. So I lived on like $100 a month. At the end of the year, he told me, your year is up. You have to go back to college. That was our deal. And I said, but I'm in the middle of a revolution. I can't go back to school. And he said, well, I can't send you any more money. So I stayed in the revolution, and I didn't ever have a lot of money, but I learned more than I'd ever learned in my life. I became an entirely different kind of very competent person with all the kinds of skills that I could potentially have developed. Each one was developed because I was forced to do things, and I enjoy learning, and I enjoy interacting with people, and I enjoy the exhilaration of feeling somehow or other we can change this culture and make a difference. That's what keeps me going.
Well, I guess we really are at opposite poles in a lot of respects. I feel the same way you do with regard to the last sentence. I think there are things we can do. But to tell you the honest truth, if the world would go away, I can think of a lot of things I'd much rather do than be involved in political activism. I don't particularly enjoy it. You know, I don't like big groups. I don't even like talking to big groups. I'm sorry, I apologize. But I certainly don't like to go to meetings. I hate to go to jail. I don't like to be maced. You know, it's... I mean, demonstrations I can't stand, and so on. But I mean, that's the honest truth. But they're just, you know, they're just things you have to do. I mean, you take a look at it doesn't take any imagination. You know, all it takes is to have your eyes open, you know, to see that really awful things are going on in the world. You can start at arm's length. You don't have to go very far. Just take a walk downtown. It's enough. Actually, take a walk to Kendall Square and look at what's happening. You know, people begging for food and so on. And then you can go far off to the rest of the world and find more. In fact, if you have a little imagination, you can think about what kind of a world we'll be leaving to future generations who don't have any voice. It doesn't seem to me possible to pay attention to those things, or to be alive, you know, and not to be aware of all of that. And it doesn't seem possible to be aware of it and not to try to do something about it, even if you don't enjoy it. And mostly I don't, to tell you the truth. Although there are satisfactions, plenty of satisfactions. I mean, most worthwhile causes, I think, I assume, are going to fail. Because they're worthwhile because they're struggles against power and authority. And the way the world works is it runs, unfortunately, mostly by force. There's people called intellectuals who try to explain that in their own country, in their own institutions, it isn't like that. But it's just not true. And that means that most things that are worth doing are going to involve a large measure of failure, sometimes disastrous failure, because you're running up against powerful and brutal forces. Sometimes there's a degree of success. I mean, over a long period, I think you can see general progress. And some of the activities have, you can see specific progress, even particular people that are helped and groups that are helped and so on. But it's small successes, hard work. I don't particularly find it, you know, it wouldn't be my first choice. If I was just thinking how to, you know, sort of be happy, I'd much rather be in my study working, to tell you the truth. There's no choice as far as I can see. There's no choice if you want to be able to look yourself in the mirror, at least.
Variously defined as the 60s, the 70s, or the revolution, or the counterculture, that 30 years that followed the end of World War II has taken on mythic proportions. Nowadays, books, films, TV productions, and popular culture have revived interest in that era's movements, fashions, music, and politics. What stands out to you as significant about that time?
Actually, I think the most significant things about that period, many of them were written by the people who were most outraged by it, and organized a very significant counterattack, which we've been living with ever since, to destroy everything that was achieved then. And they're pretty articulate and reasonably intelligent. And some of them have published things you really ought to read. Everybody ought to read. I was teaching undergraduate courses here for about 25 years on political topics, off on my own time, a lot of fun. But one thing we always had students read was, as soon as it came out, was a book called The Crisis of Democracy, which was the first publication of the Trilateral Commission. It was published in 1975. Trilateral Commission was founded by David Rockefeller, and it brought together Trilateral because it brought together elite elements from the three, what's called the triad, Japan, the United States, and Europe, three rich areas. These were mostly liberal elites, incidentally. It's the group of people who were around the Carter administration. In fact, the Carter administration was drawn entirely from that group, including Carter, so it gives you roughly their political complexion. They were scared to death by what happened in the 60s. The Crisis of Democracy, and they're very frank about it. It was not meant to be read. It was, in fact, as soon as people started reading it, I noticed it went off the market. But it was meant to be sort of an internal discussion among sort of smart guys. The American rapporteur was from big professor at Harvard. What terrified them, and they're very frank about it because it's basically an internal document, is the fact that during the 1960s, great masses of people who are ordinarily apathetic and obedient and do what they're told and don't get anybody's hair and so on, became organized and politicized and started to think for themselves and find their own ways of living, challenge authority, or put forth their demands in the political arena. That really drove them up the wall. That's the crisis of democracy. The institutions were no longer working anymore. In fact, what they call the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, meaning universities, schools, churches, and so on. The universities that were responsible for the indoctrination of the young were not doing their job. The young were getting out of control. They were, challenging authority. They were getting interested in crazy stuff like truth and justice and freedom and all that kind of business, and actually trying to do something about it. And what's more, they were really changing the country. I mean, the country really changed. It's a very different and much more civilized country than it used to be in the early 1960s in many, many respects. And this was extremely frightening to elite groups, including liberal elites, and their proposals were to try to find ways to beat back this challenge, to try to, as the American Harvard professor put it, to restore the good old days. He described it with a little bit of exaggeration. He said back in the days of the Truman years, Truman was able to govern the country with the help of a few Wall Street lawyers and financiers. Sorry for the attack on lawyers. So in those days, few Wall Street lawyers and bankers or something like that could run the country, but in the 60s, this was all getting out of control. I mean, all this rabble is getting around, this mass of people who aren't supposed to be doing anything. They're just supposed to be following orders. And we have to restore indoctrination and passivity and apathy. And there's been, in fact, from that time, a major doctrinal attack against an assault on the universities, and a very strong effort to narrow even further the rather narrow spectrum of kind of respectable discussion, the media and so on. At the same time, there's been a struggle against it. But what they were pointing to is quite real. I mean, all of those things were happening. They happened in a very exciting way. They happened. It was mostly young people. There had been the same attack. This is a cycle that we keep going through in American history. So the 1920s were an extremely apathetic period. In fact, the labor movement was totally smashed, mostly by violence at that time. And the place looked like the end of history. You know, everybody was talking about wonderful, it's all over, everybody follows orders, the rich guys get richer, and so on. The 1930s broke that up. You know, it was a period of activism on all fronts, really changed things. Immediately afterwards, in fact, by the late 30s, there was a major assault on it. That's the McCarthyism. It was kind of held off by the war for a couple of years, but then it picked up steam right in the late 40s. It's called McCarthyism, but McCarthy was a latecomer. And in fact, in my opinion, not all that important. I mean, the main things were going on, again, often led by liberal elites, well before McCarthy, and much more destructive. And the 50s became very quiet and apathetic, not as bad as the 20s, but pretty bad. And again, there were a lot of predictions. It's all over, everything's in order, you know, nobody's going to bother us anymore. And then the 60s came along, blew it out of the water, terrified the same groups. SALT starts over again. You know, we beat back the crisis of democracy. We're living in the middle of that reaction now. The things that they were worried about were real and important. And they made the country more free, more just, more honest. They changed styles. I mean, like take, say, MIT. You know, back in 1960, nobody would be dressed like this. You know, I was wearing a coat, a jacket, and a tie, and, you know, students were respectful, and, you know, I didn't say respectable, you know, and those things are not just symbols. First of all, there were no women, you know, like there's very few women, no people of color, you know, it's a nice, it was like your image of the 1950s. That's what it really was. These changes from dress style to personal relations to respect for other cultures, you know, to concern for rights, all of these things were perfectly real. They made the country a lot more civilized. They've resisted the attack. The assault has been very significant, but it's been resisted. But I think if you ask what were the 60s about, you know, I think exactly what scandalized respectable people. That's what the 60s were about.
I grew up in the 60s. I went to high school, I think I started in 1959. I started college in 1963. I got married in 1967. I had children in 69 and 70. So this is like from 15 to 25, that's that period of time, that decade. And then, so my sense of it is quite different in the sense that I thought I was in the baby boomer until I read some magazine that said, oh no, you have to be born in 46, so I guess I'm not quite a baby boomer. But there was a huge thrust of people about the same age going into educational institutes at the same time in a level and at a pace that had never happened before, and that's true of blacks and whites. And so to me, the thing that is significant is what I will refer to as the student movement. But the student movement is a very powerful and very diffuse thing, because the student population was the largest cohort that had ever in history been in college in the United States. So you have movements of students in black colleges, for example, who are challenging the extraordinarily authoritarian structure of that college. You had students at white universities who were challenging the authoritarian structure of their college after having been participants, let's say, in a civil rights summer led by students who had joined the civil rights movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, some other group. The student movement was the base out of which the anti-war movement, that was the mass movement, not the, there was anti-war movements and pacifist movements in this country from quite some time ago, but the mass movement of anti-war protest came out of the student movement. And the women's movement came out of the student movement. All the women who were involved in what became women's movement or women's liberation were women who were just as educated as these men who were in the same organizations they were in, and the men were always taking leadership positions and the women were taking notes. And some of the women began to say, well, why do I have to listen to you? My education is just as good. And the women's movement upset quite a bit of the emotional stability of men in the radical movements. I think it was Todd Gitlin who wrote that the era of the late 60s and early 70s was, he said, it was exhilarating for women and very horrible for men, or something like that. And I couldn't quite figure out what his problem was until I realized that he was one of the men who was in a position of leadership in an organization that was working along old rules, even though it was supposed to be New Left. So the thing, though, to me that stands out as significant, as the most significant, as if this did not happen, you would not have that era called the 60s or the 70s. We would not have the explosion of imaginative music and literature and theater. The thing that triggered it for me was the Vietnam War. On the one hand, that's a foreign event, but it has so many profound internal consequences for the United States, which I will start in 1954. I mean, that's at the point in which the French are defeated in Indochina, and America begins to take on a military and political role of sustaining a different type of government in Vietnam and supporting the anti-communists. And the reason I picked that date, 1954, is because the other very significant thing was the Brown decision by the United States Supreme Court that was also handed down in 1954, taking the position for the first time in 105 years, I believe, since Plessy. The Plessy decision says separation, separate but equal facilities, racial lines are constitutional. The Brown decision says segregation in education is unconstitutional. And the way that was interpreted in black communities was with exuberance and exhilaration, as the Supreme Court has said segregation is unconstitutional. It is said in education, but it was interpreted, and the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement, leaped. I mean, from that day, from the May 19th, or what date that decision was made, the movement took off. And so those two events interacting within the context of the United States gave it a dynamic, gave it a sense of purpose, a sense of possibility, also a sense of horror. I was in a movement that was very internationalist and looked at liberation struggles in Africa, liberation struggles in Asia, in China, in Cuba, and continually said if the Vietnamese can win their independence from the United States, if they can fight against the most powerful military behemoth in the world, so can we. And so that kind of dynamic and that kind of willingness to risk your life and put everything on the line to change that the Vietnam War allowed, I think significantly altered all the other possible struggles, and it generated such internal dissension and protest among whites that the whole cultural hierarchy fell apart and has been put back together, but it's not the same.
Thank you. Students often ask me, what happened, why did the 60s stop?
The Chamber of Commerce, the main business lobby, the American petroleum industry, other business lobbies have publicly proclaimed, in fact with enthusiasm, that they are carrying out a campaign to try to convince the population that global warming is a liberal hoax. And it's succeeded, unfortunately. The latest polls I've seen show maybe a third of the population believes in anthropogenic global warming. The media contribute in their own way. So, for example, when the New York Times runs a front-page article on what meteorologists think about global warming, namely, they don't believe it. Meteorologists are pretty faces who read scripts telling you if it's going to rain tomorrow. what do they have to say any more than your barber? But that's presented as if it's a significant contribution to the discussion. The same when they, in favor, in pursuit of the fabled objectivity, present two sides. One side is 98% of scientists who know anything. The other side is Senator Inhofe and a couple of stragglers, and that's the two sides. And people are supposed to make a choice between them. They leave out a third side, which is the substantial number of climate scientists who believe that the consensus predictions are much too optimistic, including some of the leading scientists right here who've recently run what they call the most extensive modeling ever done that concludes that it's far worse than anticipated, and that their own results are an understatement because they don't take into account such things as effects of methane after permafrost disappears and so on. So that's the debate that people are presented with, and it's not surprising that the effort to manufacture consent to the belief that doesn't mean anything is pretty successful. What's rather interesting about this, and tells you something about the nature of our society, is that those same CEOs and managers who are trying to convince the public that it's a liberal hoax know perfectly well that it's extremely dangerous. They have the same beliefs that you and I have. So they're caught in a kind of an institutional contradiction. As leaders of major corporations, they have an institutional role. That is to maximize short-term profit. And if they don't do that, they're out and someone else is in who does do it. So it's basically, institutionally speaking, it's not a choice. That's going to happen in the major institutions. So they may know that they're mortgaging the future of their grandchildren, and in fact, maybe everything they own will be destroyed, but they're caught in a trap of institutional structure. That's what happens in market systems. Financial crisis is a small example of the same thing. You may know that what you're doing carries systemic risk, but you can't calculate that into your transactions, or you're not fulfilling your role and somebody else replaces you. In fact, in the United States, it's actually a legal obligation to do that for corporate executives. So, and that's a very serious problem. It means that we're marching over the cliff and doing it for institutional reasons that are pretty hard to dismantle. There's other factors like the anger and fear and hostility in the country about everything carries over to this. So if you look at polls, everyone hates Congress, they hate the Democrats, they hate the Republicans even more, they hate big business, they hate banks, and they distrust scientists. So why should we believe what these pointy-headed elitists are telling us? We don't trust anything else, we don't trust them. All of this combines. The latest election a couple of days ago is you could almost interpret it as a kind of a death knell for the species. There was an article in Bloomberg Business Week, not a radical rag exactly, running through the new Republicans coming to Congress, and they're worried about them. One of the reasons is because they're global warming deniers, almost all. That means the powerful House committees, are like science and technology and so on, are going to be in the hands of people who think there's nothing to it, or at least claim that they think that. What they actually think is another story. In fact, one of them was quoted as saying, "Can't be a problem because God will take care of it." Now, if this was happening in some small country, and maybe I don't know what, Monaco or something, it wouldn't matter much. But when it's happening in the richest, most powerful country in the world, it's a danger to the survival of the species. Nobody else is going to do very much if the United States doesn't do a lot, not just some, but take the lead. So we're essentially saying, let's kiss each other goodbye.
Modern industrial civilization has developed within a certain system of convenient myths The driving force of modern industrial civilization has been individual material gain, which is accepted as legitimate, even praiseworthy, on the grounds that private vices yield public benefits in the classic formulation. Now, it's long been understood very well that a society that is based on this principle will destroy itself in time. It can only persist with whatever suffering and injustice it entails, as long as it's possible to pretend that the destructive forces that humans create are limited, that the world is an infinite resource, and that the world is an infinite garbage can. At this stage of history, either one of two things is possible. Either the general population will take control of its own destiny and will concern itself with community interests, guided by values of solidarity and sympathy and concern for others, or alternatively, there will be no destiny for anyone to control. As long as some specialized class is in a position of authority, it is going to set policy in the special interests that it serves. But the conditions of survival, let alone justice, require rational social planning in the interests of the community as a whole, and by now that means the global community. The question is whether privileged elites should dominate mass communication and should use this power as they tell us they must, namely to impose necessary illusions, to manipulate and deceive the stupid majority and remove them from the public arena. The question in brief is whether democracy and freedom are values to be preserved or threats to be avoided. In this possibly terminal phase of human existence, democracy and freedom are more than values to be treasured. They may well be essential to survival.